I've never been one to believe in ghosts. I always considered the paranormal as stories people told to scare each other, exaggerations of the imagination, or people being just downright silly. But after what happened during my stay at my grandfather's old house, I can't explain what I saw in any other way. Growing up, I spent my summers at my grandfather's home in a quiet rural town in Pennsylvania, a place where time seemed to move at its own unhurried pace. His house was an aging two-story colonial-style home, its white paint peeling at the edges revealing dark wood beneath. It had been in our family for a couple of generations, standing like a silent sentinel at the edge of a dense, sprawling forest, where the trees whispered secrets in the wind. The land surrounding it stretched for acres, an expanse of rolling fields and wildflowers that swayed under the golden afternoon sun. As a child, I never found the house frightening. To me it was a place of adventure, a setting for endless summer days filled with exploration. But looking back, there was something undeniably eerie about it, the way the wooden floorboards groaned under invisible weight, the way the attic door would drift open despite being firmly latched, or the inexplicable cold spots that would linger even on the most sweltering of July afternoons. The hall seemed to hold echoes of the past, and sometimes, in the quietest moments of the evening, I swore I could hear faint whispers carried through the rafters, whispers of unseen people. After my grandfather passed away, the house sat vacant for a while, but when I was 22, my mum asked me to stay there for a weekend to check in on the place. She was thinking of selling it and needed somebody to make sure that everything was still in order before she put it on the market. I agreed, not thinking much of it at the time. It was just a house, familiar, full of memories. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. I arrived late in the afternoon. The house was exactly as I remembered, though a little dustier, a little darker. The air inside was thick, carrying that unmistakable smell of old wood and neglect. I walked through the rooms, checking the windows and making sure that the locks still worked. Everything seemed fine, until I got upstairs to the hallway. The attic door was open. I stopped in my tracks. That door never stayed shut when I was a kid, and my grandfather had put a latch on it years ago to keep it closed. The latch was still there, but it had been flipped open. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my mum had been up there recently and forgot to lock it. But something about it felt wrong, like I was being watched or didn't understand something. I hesitated before walking away, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. That night, after making myself a quick dinner, I decided to settle into the living room with an old book that I'd found on one of the shelves. The house was dead silent, except for the occasional groan of the wood beams shifting. I kept glancing towards the hallway, half expecting to see something standing there, watching me. At one point, I swore I heard whispering. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but enough to send my skin crawling. It was coming from upstairs. I held my breath listening, but the sound faded as quickly as it started. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the sound of wind slipping through the cracks in old walls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been speaking just out of earshot. Around midnight, I finally turned off the lights and went to bed in one of the old guest rooms. The house was so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the old grandfather clock downstairs. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like something was waiting just beyond the line of sight. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep, my mind thinking back to the attic door. Had it really opened on its own, or had someone or something been up there? At some point I must have dozed off, because a noise woke me in the middle of the night. A soft creak, like footsteps on the old wooden floor. My heart started pounding as I lay there frozen, straining my ears. Then another step followed, slow and deliberate, just outside my bedroom door. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I struggled to steady my breath. My fingers gripped the blanket, too afraid to move. The footsteps didn't continue down the hall. They stopped right outside my door. And then I heard the attic door creak open. Summoning all my resolve, I grabbed my phone and flashlight and crept slowly towards the door. Every instinct in my body screaming at me to stay put, but I needed to see. I needed to know what was in the hallway. Tentatively, I pushed the door open to the sharp sounds of slow creaking. The hallway was empty. The attic door, which I'd made sure was latched shut earlier, was now standing wide open. A draft seeped from the opening, sending a chill down my spine. My hands were shaking as I lifted the flashlight, shining it up into the darkness beyond the attic ladder, and that's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the swollen dimness, crouched at the far end of the attic in the most distorted way. Its outline was thin and unnatural, its limbs too long, its posture twisted as if it had been folded into the shadows themselves. The flickering light from my flashlight barely reached it, but I could make out the vague shape of something crawling. A long and imposing but impossibly formed thing, waiting, watching. It wasn't moving, it wasn't breathing, it was just there, a silent, unnatural presence staring at me from the darkness. My chest tightened, every hair on my body stood on end. A slow, creeping cold spread through me, coiling around my spine like a vice. The air in the attic had changed. It was thicker, heavier, like it was alive, pressing me down into the wooden floor. The musty scent of aged wood and dust suddenly laced with something else, something damp, something rotten, like earth unsettled after years of being undisturbed. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, to do anything but stand there frozen. But my body refused to obey. My fingers trembled around the flashlight, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. And then, just as my mind began to process the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing, the figure shifted. It moved towards me. Not with the shuffling, hesitant steps of something human, but with a slow, fluid, crawling motion, like a shadow stretching unnaturally across the floor. Its shape was warped as it crawled closer, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't, as if the very act of moving was an unnatural performance. As it moved closer, the face of a young woman emerged from the shadows. A low, almost imperceptible sound rose in the air, a whisper, or maybe a sigh, too faint to be real, but chilling enough to send ice through my veins. I still couldn't move, I couldn't scream. It continued gliding towards me. I stumbled back, slamming into the wall. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second the beam cut across its face, revealing pale, hollow, dead, shark-like eyes, devoid of all feeling and emotion. A gaping mouth stretched open as if screaming, but only silence erupted from her contorted face. I pulled up my arm to cover my face, and in doing so the flashlight streaked once again across the being. The moment the light hit it, the figure vanished. I didn't wait, I ran. Down the stairs, through the living room, I grabbed my keys from the table and headed out the front door. I jumped into my car and sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't go back inside until the sun came up. I left that afternoon and never went back. My mum sold the house a month later, and I never told her what happened. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. I'm now a firm believer in the paranormal, but sometimes I still dream about it. The pale face in the attic, the way it watched me, the way it moved, and in those dreams I don't always wake up before it reaches me. I don't expect anybody to believe this story. If somebody told me what I'm about to tell you, I probably wouldn't believe them either. But I know what I saw and what I felt, and no amount of rationalizing can change that. I'm just a normal guy, I live alone in a quiet part of town, work a typical 9-to-5 job, and don't get into trouble. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts or anything paranormal, but after what happened to me a few months ago, I don't know what to believe anymore. It all started when I moved into my new place. It was a small, old house on the outskirts of town, nestled in a wooded area. The house was an odd little thing, tilted slightly to the left as if it had been leaning into the wind for the past 50 years. The once white sidings were now a patchwork of peeling paint and exposed wood. The roof sported a few mismatched shingles, evidence of hasty repairs. A crooked metal mailbox sat at the end of a narrow front yard, which was more weeds than grass, and the wooden porch creaked ominously underfoot. Inside, the house had character, though not necessarily charm. The front door stuck in humid weather, and the living room ceiling had a persistent stain in the shape of a lopsided heart. The floors were warped in places, making furniture placement a creative endeavour, and the kitchen linoleum was an outdated checkerboard pattern, faded and peeling in the corners. The oven was vintage, not in a trendy way, and groaned when in use. A single steep staircase led to the second floor, where doors didn't quite fit their frames, and a draught whispered through the hallway all year round. The bathroom had clawfoot tub legs painted a cheerful green, a mystery given the rest of the house's muted tones. In the back, an enclosed porch, once meant for summer evenings, has become a refuge for a family of stubborn stray cats. Despite its quirks and its age, the house has a certain warmth. Like I said, it wasn't anything fancy, but it had charm. Creaky wooden floors, a fireplace in the living room, and an old but functional kitchen. The rent was cheap, which, looking back, should have been my first red flag, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. I settled into my routine. Work, dinner, a little bit of TV before bed. The only thing that stood out was how eerily quiet it got at night. There was no traffic, no distant city sounds, just the occasional rustling of the trees outside. It was peaceful, but in a way that felt off. It was like the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little noise. After a few weeks, the weird stuff started happening. At first, it was little things. I'd wake up to find the kitchen cabinet open when I was sure I'd closed it. My keys would be on the counter when I knew I left them on the coffee table. I blamed it on forgetfulness, maybe I was just tired or distracted. But then it got worse. One night I woke up at around 2 AM to the sound of something shuffling outside my bedroom door. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of the house it was impossible to ignore. My heart started pounding as I listened. It was slow and deliberate, like somebody was dragging their feet just outside my room. I sat up, frozen. The sound stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else, but there was only silence. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Maybe I'd heard the house settling or the wind outside. I eventually fell back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The next night it happened again, but this time the sound didn't stop. It moved slowly down the hall towards the living room. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, trying to steel myself before getting up to check. I crept up to my bedroom door and creaked it open just a little, enough to peek down the hallway. There was nothing there. I exhaled, laughing nervously at myself. Maybe a mouse or those damned cats had found a way inside. It seemed logical, but still I slept with the bedroom door locked that night. A week passed by, and thankfully there were no incidents. I started to think that maybe I'd just been paranoid, but then something happened that I just can't explain. I had a friend over, Mike. We were sitting in the living room drinking a couple of beers and watching some random movie. I hadn't told him about the weird noises because honestly I didn't want to sound crazy. But at one point he paused the movie and looked at me confused. "Dude, do you have a roommate or something?" he asked. I frowned before replying. "No, why?" He pointed towards the darkened hallway. I swear to God, I just saw somebody walk past that door. Every hair on my body stood on end. I turned to look, but there was nothing there, only the hallway and the claustrophobic darkness. My stomach dropped. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded. "Dude, I saw a shadow move past, like a full-on figure. I thought maybe it was somebody getting up." We both sat there in silence for a moment. Then, trying to play it cool, I grabbed my phone and motioned Mike to follow me. We checked every room, every closet, but there was nothing. The front and the back doors were still locked, nothing in the house was gone, nothing was out of place. The whole time Mike looked confused and afraid. I don't know if he believes in this stuff, but the activity certainly was disconcerting for both of us. After our search, we didn't return to the movie. Instead, he made his excuses and left. I didn't blame him. We both felt an oppressive, malevolent energy suffocating us. That night, I barely slept. I left a light on in the room outside to stave off the oppressive dark that seemed to encroach with every day that I spent living in that house. I tried to convince myself that there had to be a rational explanation, but at around 3 AM, I woke up to something worse than the sound of shuffling. I woke up because I felt something breathing next to me. Lying on my side, I didn't move. My eyes stayed fixed on the wall, my back turned towards whatever was there. My entire body locked up. The presence, real or imagined, settled in the darkness behind me. My mind clawed for logic, for reason, but all it found was the cold grip of unknowing fear. My skin prickled, each hair standing rigid as if bracing for what was to come next. I listened, every nerve straining. My heartbeat became a deafening drum in my ears. I wanted to turn, to look, to prove to myself that I was alone and imagining this. But the fear of seeing something I dreaded prevented me from moving. Seconds later, I could hear it more clearly. Shallow, raspy breathing, like somebody was standing right beside my bed. And then I felt it, a weight. The mattress shifted slightly, as if somebody had just sat down at the edge of my bed behind my feet. I wanted to turn, to see what it was, but I was too scared. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. Seconds passed. I still couldn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel a presence of maleficence. I got the overwhelming sense that I wasn't welcome in this house. Then suddenly, the breathing stopped. The weight lifted. But before I could let out a relieved breath, the bedsheets moved. I felt the sensation of cold fingers brush against my back, slow and deliberate, as if somebody was tracing the outline of my spine. My breath hitched and my muscles tensed. Then, in absolute silence, I heard the faintest whisper. Too quiet to make out the words, but undeniably there. A voice. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to go away, to let me wake up from what had to be a nightmare. The touch lingered for a second longer, then melted away before completely disappearing. The air in the room felt different, denser, heavier. It was like the very atmosphere had changed, and I was trapped in something unnatural. I didn't move for what felt like hours. When I finally gathered the courage to reach for my phone and turn the flashlight on, the room was empty, and the door was still closed. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day I made the decision to get the hell out of that house. I called my landlord and told him something was wrong with the place and that I needed to break the lease. He didn't even argue. He just told me he understood. That's what really freaked me out. He didn't ask why. He didn't even sound surprised. I moved out by the end of the week. My new place is in the city, surrounded by noise and people. I sleep with the TV on and I never let my apartment get too quiet. But sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear that rasping breathing, like something followed me. My name is Eric, and this happened to me and my wife Sarah a little over a year ago. To this day we don't talk about it much, mostly because we don't really have an explanation for what happened. Sarah and I had been looking for a house for months before we found it, a beautiful old Victorian home on the outskirts of town, nestled at the end of a long tree-lined driveway. The house was massive, too big for just the two of us, but the price was almost too good to be true. It had been sitting on the market for years and nobody seemed interested in buying it. We assumed due to people preferring modern homes and didn't think much of it. The place had an eerie charm with intricate woodwork, tall ceilings and a wraparound porch, but it was the attic that stuck with me. It had one of those old-fashioned pull-down ladders, and when we first toured the house, I remember getting a strange feeling in my gut just looking at it. The real estate agent never mentioned anything about the attic, and honestly, I didn't ask. Our first few nights in the house were uneventful. We spent our time unpacking, settling in, and enjoying the quiet. It wasn't until about a week later when we started noticing things. It always happened around the same time, late at night, usually between 2 and 3 AM. We would hear it coming from the attic, faint footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, and sometimes, softer than anything else, a muffled, almost sobbing sound. At first we tried to ignore it. The house was old after all. The wood expands, shifts and settles, but the noises didn't stop. In fact, they started to become more distinct. The footsteps weren't random creaks, they were deliberate, as though somebody was pacing. One night Sarah shook me awake. "Eric, listen," she said. I sat up in my bed, heart already racing, and then I heard it. Slow, shuffling footsteps above us, directly over our bed. "Maybe there's an animal up there," I whispered. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The sound wasn't erratic, like a raccoon or a rat. It was measured, almost as though a human was walking up there. Needless to say, neither of us slept that night. The next day I decided to check it out. In the daylight it seemed ridiculous to be scared. I grabbed a flashlight and pulled down the attic ladder. A cloud of dust rained down as I climbed up. The air up there was thick and stale. It smelled like old wood and something else, something sour. The attic was unsettling. The wooden beams overhead loomed like ribs, the floorboards warped and groaned under my weight. There were no windows, only slivers of dim light filtering through the cracks in the roof. The dust in the air seemed to swirl unnaturally, like it had been disturbed just moments before. A faint chill wrapped around me, though the summer heat outside made that impossible. I swept the light around the space, expecting to see insulation, boxes, and maybe forgotten furniture. But the attic was empty, completely bare. No signs of animals, and certainly no footprints in the dust. That night the noises came back, louder, more insistent. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore, there were sounds of something dragging across the floor, a scraping noise like furniture being moved. And worst of all, the sobbing had become clearer, and we could make out a woman sobbing. Sarah was terrified, and I won't lie, I was too. But I refused to believe that our house was haunted. That kind of thing just didn't happen in real life. A few nights later, the situation escalated. We were lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting, and like clockwork, the footsteps began. But this time they weren't just in the attic, they were coming up and down the attic pull-down ladder. Sarah gripped my arm so tightly it hurt. "Eric," she whispered. The ladder creaked under the weight of something unseen. Step by step the sound got closer. I jumped out of bed, flipped on the light, and grabbed the baseball bat that I kept by the door, convinced that we had an intruder or a squatter. But when I swung round to face the attic, the ladder was still up. No one was there. That was the final straw. The next morning I told Sarah we had to go up there together. Whatever was happening, we had to face it. Armed with my flashlight and a crowbar, because honestly I didn't know what else to do, we pulled down the ladder and climbed up together. The moment we entered, something felt wrong. The air was heavier than before, pressing on us like a weight. Every step I made, the floor creaked, but it wasn't just the sound that unnerved me. It was the feeling that something was observing, like an omniscience that transcended reality was enveloping us. And that's when we saw. The attic was no longer empty. At the far end of the room, something had changed, or at least appeared to change. There was a door, an old wooden door that we were sure hadn't been there before. The wood was warped as if it had been exposed to moisture for years, yet there was no leak in the attic. The handle was rusted and deep scratches marred the frame, like someone or something had been trying to get out. The weirdest part was that it was slightly open. I exchanged a glance with Sarah, and despite every instinct in my body telling me not to, I gently moved over to the door, straining my ears for any hint of sound. Using the tip of the crowbar, I pushed the door open, leaning to the side as I did so, straining to see whatever was on the other side. Beyond was a small room, a perfectly preserved nursery, except it looked like something from a history book. A rocking chair sat in the corner and a small wooden crib was against the far wall. Old dusty antique toys were scattered across the floor, and the walls were painted a soft flowery blue, which was peeling in places but still visible in the dull light. And on a small nightstand next to the crib was a small porcelain doll. its glassy eyes staring right at us. Before I could understand what I was seeing, Sarah let out a sharp gasp and covered her mouth. "Eric," she whispered, "we need to go." But I couldn't move, my eyes were locked onto the crib. The blanket inside was pulled up neatly as if somebody had just tucked a child into bed. And then, in the swollen silence, we heard it. A soft, raspy breath. The breath of a toddler or a small child about to wake. The crib shook slightly, and that's when I noticed. The blanket wasn't flat. Something was under the blanket, and it had the shape of an infant. Without thinking, I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her back. We bolted down the attic ladder and slammed the attic door shut and ran out of the house. We spent that night in a hotel. The next day we went back, but only long enough to grab some essentials. I didn't check the attic again. I didn't want to know if that door was still there. But after taking some time to process what we'd seen and what we'd heard, we decided not to do anything too drastic, like sell up or move out. We didn't get a sense of malice. Instead, we realised that the house possessed an inherent sorrow, and a sadness that didn't seem to dissipate with time. A few months later, curiosity got the better of me, and I did some research. It turns out the house belonged to a family back in the 1920s. Their young son had died of pneumonia in the attic. His parents had kept him up there, isolated, believing fresh air would cure him. But he never made it. They say his mother never recovered from the loss. She was driven ill with despair and couldn't accept that her beautiful boy had passed. She kept his room exactly as it was, praying for him to come back to her. Worn and emaciated, she eventually succumbed to the sadness and died alone in that house 3 years later. I don't know what we saw in that attic. All I do know is that whatever was in that crib was the sweet memory of a beautiful child whose premature passing destroyed a family. And those cries of sorrow were most likely the residual weepings of a heartbroken mother, begging her son to come back to her. Learning of the sadness that clung to this house, we wanted to help, so we engaged with our local church. A priest agreed to bless the house and pray for the child and its parents. The night following his visit, all activity ceased, and the house began at last to feel like a home. That oppressive sorrow was no more. Now, every night, Sarah and I say a prayer for the spirits that we encountered, and we hope that at last they found the peace that they deserve.